Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name is Josh, and thanks for joining me on a new episode of our album review series. It's been quite a while since we've last done one. The last one was actually Kid Cudi's Man on the Moon 3, which I did on December 26th, so yeah, quite some time, and glad to be going back into these. Thanks for tuning in today. This is going to be episode 44. The name of the album is Drunk Tank Pink by the band Shame. Pretty excited to cover this. I did not actually know that they were going to release an album so soon here in January. But yeah, good album to start off the new year to cover. And yeah, just before we get started, I just want to let everyone know the latest thing that I released on the podcast was an episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week for the week of January 16th. Pretty interesting week overall. Some diverse entries by a wide range of artists, anything from like Glass Animals to Florida Georgia Line, Little Durk, Eric Church, Justin Bieber, Black Eyed Peas. So yeah, just a variety and a plethora of different artists and genres. Go ahead and check that episode out if you have not. But yeah, there will obviously be a new episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week probably dropping after this review. Looks like that one might involve a mini or a full album bomb of Morgan Wallen's latest album, which I'm not too crazy about, but we'll get through it. Don't know if I'll end up covering that album with the review by itself, but we'll just kind of wing it on that front when I'm listening to it the first time. But yeah, let's go ahead and get to the gist of this review. Like I said earlier, the album was from the band Shame, and the album is Drunk Tank Pink, which was released on January 15th on Dead Oceans, which is a pretty prominent record label in the indie world. And according to Wikipedia, Shame are technically classified as an alternative rock band from South London, England. But I'd say Shame is actually more of a post-punk indie rock band that's really just more of a post-punk band that has obvious contemporaries, and if you wanted to compare them to bands like Idols or Proto Martyr or Fontaines DC, especially the ones that are coming out of the UK, or in the case of Fontaines DC, I think they're Scottish or Irish. They are kind of more along the lines of that brand of post-punk, but nonetheless, there are several post-punk bands out right now that have a lot of critical acclaim, and I'd say Shame definitely fits into this category. Furthermore, the group's debut album actually released back in 2018 of January, titled Songs of Praise, and they received critical acclaim from publications like NME, Paste, and Clash. And that debut record did release on Dead Oceans as well. And like I was saying before, that label features a bunch of indie heavyweights, Phoebe Bridgers, Bright Eyes, Destroyer, even Slowdive. There really isn't much info, though, regarding the band's origins or info about the respective band members. I'd say, though, it's quite impressive that they have come so quickly into a reputation and I guess a certain expectation of the band so quickly on their sophomore album, with, I guess, their formation or their debut album barely releasing in 2018. And I actually discovered Shame around 2017, I believe, before the band released this debut album. And all I was really doing, I was just looking at some old South by Southwest videos from their performance earlier that year in 2017, I believe. And I kind of just do that every year when there's a normal year. of South by Southwest. It's a good way of finding some pretty good bands and some up-and-coming artists that are probably going to be more well-known within the next year or so. And that actually ended up being the case with Shame. Shame was just a random band that I ended up really being impressed by after seeing some of their clips of their performance of a showcase they did at Cheer Up Charlie's in Austin. And the band had a really great stage presence to them, and they sounded great. I was even more intrigued when it was obvious that these guys were from across the pond and from the UK. And it's always interesting seeing a band that has made quite a journey to play in a country in front of a crowd that's quite modest. Sometimes those South by Southwest crowds, especially in a place like Chirp Charlie's, they're really not that big. They certainly aren't the same size as playing a venue such as Stubbs across the street where they're playing in front of thousands of people, which I'd say nowadays they might be able to get that sort of crowd in a normal year, obviously. Yeah, the rest is history. I ended up really digging the band's sound. I thought they were fun, energetic, and I thought they brought an interesting dynamic to the post-punk and indie scene. Actually tacking on that debut album, Songs of Praise, I really found songs like Concrete. I feel like that track really stood out off of that debut album, mainly because of the driving punk aesthetic to the track with the new wave elements fused inside it as well. Another track, One Rizla, I thought that track was reminiscent of earlier indie rock of the 2000s, even some Britpop bands as well. It's a fun track, and I also love the sultry nature of the lick with the slow and pronounced bass line structuring the track. The chorus on that track even sounds like something that the Smiths could have written as well. And around like the middle section of the album, most of the bulk of the album, I felt the band got lost in making tracks that were really energetic and concise, but maybe weren't at the level of some of the better stuff, such as the stuff that was presented earlier on the track listing. But later on, we do have some highlights with the track Angie, where we see a more sensitive side of the band, where they execute a less aggressive aesthetic that almost sounds like it leans on some pretty traditional Britpop elements again. And the track sounds like it could be like a blend of an Oasis or Blur song. And I thought that's really off of that debut album what made it so interesting. They managed to incorporate a lot of influences on this traditional post-punk sound and make it their own. And it was captivating. I thought it was a decent album. But now heading into this new album, Drunk Tank Pink, I found that the band has tapped into another sort of filter or perspective on this post-punk sound, where I'd say it's an improvement. I'd say this album feels a little bit more mature, but it doesn't fall into some of the blandness that happens in a typical sophomore slump of a band. I feel like they kept the energy going and kind of made even more of a captivating album. Starting even with the track Alphabet, I wasn't too crazy about it. I liked the track, but I didn't find it quite to be a highlight. I do love the crisp drum track here and the pummeling bass line that's a bit muddy but energetic, and that kind of thing shows up several times on this album. It's a nice opening track, but I wouldn't say we get a highlight until the second track, Nigel Hitter, which this track kind of just starts like this whole series of bangers on this album that I think are just excellent. On this track, I like the upbeat and post-punk nature of the track. There's a nice punchy bass riff on this track that kind of reminds me of the last Pottery album that I reviewed last year. A lot of this album kind of reminds me of that album, actually, Welcome to Bobby's Motel. And there's some nice hooky guitar material as well that's thrown in the track. That kind of carries an eerie and dirty tone to it. There's also another crisp drum track here that I really appreciate. And I just love how every voice in this song just works off of each other, sort of like the song is connecting pieces of a puzzle. Also, I dig some of the vocal presence. There's a nice attitude presented on the closing lines of the track, and overall it's just a solid track. The next track, Born in Luden, this track is really solid as well. There's an upbeat nature to here on this track as well. There's some very rhythmic guitar parts as well, with some dry textures on them, and some intricate guitar work too that is a little similar to the previous track, where these pieces are just kind of forming a bigger puzzle, really, and coming together quite well. The track takes a left turn about a minute in, where we get a moody and down-tempo B section on this track. And there's a darker atmosphere that's definitely created here. But I do love the chaotic and messy nature overall in this track. This track definitely brings in a more interesting flavor to the album overall. I also dig the mechanical nature that's here on this track. There's like this rigid, sort of like very linear, I guess, nature to the track. And I really just love this, the build up to this climatic area on this track, where everything just gains more sound and just becomes so vast. It's executed quite well, and it gives the track an effect with this very big sound on here. And it gives the track a really nice effect with the very big sounding moments that are created at this moment. The next track, March Day, I love the hooky intro on the guitar work as well. It's bright, it's playful. It's another track with some upbeat nature to it as well. Nice transition to the chorus with the I can't get up, I won't get up refrain. That's a very catchy moment on the album. And then also on this chorus, there's a bit of some ambient nature to it that brings a lot of energy. Also, there's some sour guitar lines that are just kind of the cherry on top, and just makes the sound of the album, of this track, just so good. And I love the smooth guiding bass line on here that just cuts through everything. It kind of reminds me of like some King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard material, or Pottery as well. Best track thus far, I think, on the album. Next track, Water in the Well, I didn't quite find to be a highlight, although I will say this track, I heard some similarity to like some more energetic indie pop and rock from that was pretty prominent in like the mid 2000s or early 2010s. Think bands like The Hives. I feel like this track is very reminiscent of that sort of thing. The next track, Snow Day, I appreciate the lovely fast and agile drum work that's presented on here, and there's a strummed opening guitar riff that has a lot of character, and it gives the track a sort of unresolved feeling. I'm not sure though if I dig the transition to like this more chaotic section with a very messy, with some very messy guitar work and this sort of free flowing sense to everything. But overall, I thought it was an interesting track. We really don't get much of a highlight until the next track, Human for a Minute, which I really believe is one of the better tracks on this song, on this album as well. I like the soft vocal presence here and how it gives a nice dynamic shift to everything that's presented thus far on this album. And there's a really nice effect going on with like this ostinato bass line that structures the whole entire track. And this track definitely has a more ambient mood on here. It's there's some very subtle dark colors that are thrown in that give the track a sort of mysterious nature. And it's a really moody track. I love the line, "I've never felt human before you" refrain. Totally dig that section of the track. And there's a bit of sludginess to the track as well at times, and also a lovely melodic guitar material that's presented in the bridge. It's definitely one of my favorite tracks on this album. The next track, Great Dog, is pretty interesting as well. We get some more of this mechanical and rigid nature to things, such as like the stuff that I mentioned earlier off the Pottery album. And I like the upbeat and chugging nature to this track as well. There's some interesting usage of these sour and accented guitar riffs at times. And there's also a buzzy and rhythmic guitar work that structures this track. And I kind of get like this sense of this track being very energetic and concise. And I was thinking of like bands that this reminds me of. I was thinking maybe Queens of the Stone Age, like a very light Queens of the Stone Age. And then it dawned on me to check who produced this. And lo and behold, we actually ended up getting James Ford, who is the longtime producer of most of the Arctic Monkeys albums. And honestly, I can see a bit of Arctic Monkeys influence with the punk nature on most of these tracks. It's not so obvious, but you get like certain things like these very rhythmic, punchy bass lines that can be equated to several Arctic Monkeys songs, and then also the British flair on here as well, of course. But I'd say that if you look a little bit even deeper, Queens of the Stone Age is, of course, fronted by Josh Homme, which produced the third Arctic Monkeys album, or some of it at least, Humbug, which is another weird connection to Queens of the Stone Age. So yeah, I went off on a little bit of a tangent, but thought that was worth noting. But the next track, 6-1, I find to be a good track as well. I like the moody opening nature to this track, with the squeaky and fuzzy opening guitar riff over this swift and crisp drum track. Nice overall mood, especially with the way the shouting vocals hover over the band. I like the intricate nature here as well, with all the parts fitting together, again, like a puzzle. And then there's a nice build-up moment in the bridge with some marching snare hits, a nice fat and buzzy bass line as well that drives everything in this climatic section later on in the track. And there's a killer transition, almost seamless, to the next track, Harsh Degrees. We're immediately greeted by a nice hitting and synthy bass sound that immediately transitions to another chaotic and messy sounding track, with some dirty guitar texture smothered all over it. And it's over this compound time signature, which I thought was pretty cool. It gives the track some overall contrast to the rest of the album. The vocals do sound a bit preachy at time, but there's an interesting presence in that respect to the vocals. And the track aims to be very climatic and have a lot of presence. Another killer good drum track though on this, just sounds so precise and crisp. It's interesting tracks. There's also some nice subtle synth elements to it that I thought were interesting. And then we're pretty much at the end of the album with the last track, Station Wagon. Now, I don't really quite find this a highlight in terms of the overall grand picture, but I think Station Wagon is an excellent closer. It's more of a simmered down track, where we get a nice simple bass riff that greets you on here. And that creates a really low-key mood, along with the drums that provide a nice accompaniment for the vocalist to perform over, and it's executed quite well. I love the questioning sounding guitar lines that are thrown in the verses. It kind of creates an uncertain mood to this track. And there's even some crispy piano chords that create a nice effect as well, to add some more flavor. And this is probably one of the more moodier moments on the album with respect to the other track, Human for a Minute. But here there's a B section that has a dramatic shift with a monologue talking section that's thrown in that feels very poetic. And then we get like this huge build up with these pulsing eighth notes that the band just kind of aims to go in a very dramatic and climatic ending that kind of just builds and gets louder and messier as it progresses. And it's just a very grandiose way to end this album. But yeah, a lot of this album was just super consistent, energetic, not really any dull moments. At times there are a bit of repetitive. There is a sense of repetitiveness in some tracks where the riff is just kind of like the whole entire song and it's just looped over and over again. But I feel like for the most part, this album is very captivating. And honestly, I'm getting the same sense of enjoyment from when I reviewed Pottery's album, Welcome to Bobby's Motel. I see a lot of parallels to that album, but I feel like this album is just as good, and it has its own character and nature to it. And I just think this was worth the listen, honestly. If you plan to listen to this album, I would say definitely don't prolong it, because this is quite good. I thoroughly think that this band is barely scratching the surface as well, like especially on areas where I even hear some synth work thrown in. I feel like that can be explored further to create a even darker sound for Shame. I was about to call them Pottery. But Shame. Even tracks like Human for a Minute, I would love for them to explore that sort of songwriting style and aesthetic a little bit further. But yeah, just some solid tracks. And I'm feeling an 8 out of 10 if I had to score it. If you are a fan of Shame, I think there's a high possibility you're really going to like this album. Especially if you're a fan of the sound of bands like Idols and stuff like that. if you're like an indie rock or punk rock listener. Also think if you're big on like rhythm, just fast, energetic, very sometimes intricate parts, you might really appreciate this album as well. I think this album, for the typical rock listener even, there should be some things most people can appreciate. But yeah, 8 out of 10 on here. Great way to start the year off in terms of reviews. Yeah, I'm excited to see what this year holds in terms of music. But anyways, if you stuck with me to the end of this review, thanks for listening to this episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. If you want to leave some feedback on YouTube, good or bad, go ahead and like and subscribe, leave a comment. I'm all ears, but also subscribe on your respective streaming service as well. And yeah, I'll catch you guys later.